Montana Territory, 1888. Nathaniel Hollis had $6.20 folded in his coat pocket. A forge that leaked smoke through a crack he hadn't found time to patch, and a 6-year-old daughter perched on an overturned bucket, watching him work with the kind of solemn attention only children give to things they don't yet understand. "Papa, is that shoe gonna fit the sheriff's horse?" "If I do my job right, Josie, it'll fit like it grew there. Mr. Pruitt says you charge too little." "Mr. Pruitt charges too much and does half the work. There's a difference." Josephine Hollis considered this with the gravity of a much older person, then went back to lining up horseshoe nails in a row on the dirt, sorting them by size the way her father had taught her, without ever meaning to teach her anything at all. $6.20 didn't stretch far, not with winter coming and Josie's boots already pinching at the toe, the leather cracked clean across both big toes where she'd grown past them weeks ago. Nate didn't say that part out loud. There wasn't any use in a child carrying worry that belonged to a grown man's shoulders. He'd priced new boots at the Mercantile the week before. $2.15 for a pair, sturdy enough to last the winter. He'd have to shoe 4 more horses just to cover it, on top of everything else the season demanded of him. "Papa, can we get flapjacks for supper tonight?" "We'll see how the day treats us, Josie Bird." It was the answer he gave most days lately, and she'd stopped pressing on it, the way children learn to stop pressing on things once they sense the shape of a worry they're too young yet to name outright. He'd come to Larkspur Crossing 2 years back with nothing but a set of tools, a toddler, and a grief he didn't discuss. Folks in town knew him as steady, fair-priced, and quiet about his past, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Nobody asked why a man who could read an assay report better than most territorial surveyors was content pounding out horseshoes for 80 cents a set. Nobody knew to ask. A wagon rattled to a stop outside the forge, kicking up dust, and a ranch hand climbed down looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "You Hollis?" "That's right. Ms. Voss needs her hay rake fixed. Today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Or she says she'll ride to Larkspur herself and drag somebody back who can manage a simple repair." Nate wiped his hands on his apron and glanced at Josie, who was already grinning, sensing a story in the making. "Tell Mrs. Voss I'll have it done before supper." The hand looked doubtful. 2 other men already tried and quit on it. Foreman said it needs a whole new axle, and there ain't one to be had this side of Bozeman. "Wasn't planning on needing an axle," Nate said, already reaching for his tools. "You sure about that?" "I generally am." The Voss ranch sprawled across the valley floor like it had grown there naturally. Fences running arrow straight, cattle scattered dark against gold grass, and Margaret Voss stood in the yard, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, glaring at the broken hay rake, as though it had personally offended her. "If you're about to tell me it needs a new axle," she said, without turning around, "you can climb right back on that wagon." Wasn't going to say axle. She turned then, and Nate found himself measured, top to bottom, in the space of about 2 seconds. His hands first, calloused and scarred from the forge, then his wagon, then his face, like she was deciding something important and didn't intend to take long about it. "You're new. 2 years in town. Name's Hollis." "Well, Mr. Hollis, I've had 2 men out here already, and both of them told me a different lie about what's wrong with my rake. I don't have patience left over for a third. I don't tell lies, Mrs. Voss. Bad for business." She crossed her arms, unconvinced, and gestured toward the offending machine like she was daring it to embarrass her again. Nate crouched down without another word. It took him under 2 minutes to find it, a drive pin, forced in crooked by somebody in a hurry, walking looser with every rotation until it finally seized the whole mechanism. "It's not the axle," he said. "It's this pin. Somebody drove it in wrong the first time and it's been working itself loose ever since. I can true it up. Won't need new parts, won't need Bozeman." "How long?" "Give me an hour. The other 2 took all day and left it worse than they found it. I'm not the other 2. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that Nate noticed it and filed it away without meaning to. "We'll see," she said, and walked off toward the barn to settle some other dispute, leaving him to his work. He had the rake running clean in 50 minutes. She checked it herself, running it a short stretch across the yard, watching the tines bite even and true. When she came back, she didn't gush. She wasn't the gushing kind. She just nodded once, counted $1.10 into his palm and said, "You'll do." It wasn't warm. But Nate had learned, a long time back, that fare mattered a great deal more than warm, and that most people who offered warmth cheap rarely meant it anyway. The second time Nate came to the Voss ranch, it was for a cracked wagon wheel. And he brought Josie along. Because there was nobody in town free to mind her that particular afternoon, Margaret Voss stepped out onto the porch, took one look at the little girl sitting primly on the wagon bench, with a rag doll clutched in both arms, and something in her whole bearing eased in a way Nate hadn't seen from her before. "That's your daughter? Josie. She's 6. She's welcome to wait inside, out of this sun. I've got lemonade that needs drinking before it spoils." It wasn't a large kindness, but it was the kind of thing plenty of ranch owners in the territory never once thought to offer a hired man's child, and Nate noticed it the way he noticed most things, quietly, and without comment. Josie came back an hour later, with a faint lemonade mustache, and news she considered very important. "Papa, Mrs. Voss has a whole room just for books. She let me look at the pictures in one about horses from clear across the ocean." "Did she now?" "She said I could come back and look at more, if you don't mind it." Nate glanced toward the porch, where Margaret Voss stood watching the two of them, arms loosely crossed, wearing an expression she likely didn't realize she was making. "I don't mind it at all," Nate said. 3 weeks in, a fever swept through the bunkhouse and laid up half the Voss hands at once, including a boy of 16 named Curtis, who took it worse than the rest. The nearest doctor was 2 days out on a difficult birth, and Margaret Voss sat up with her sick hands 2 nights running herself, cooling foreheads with wrung rags, refusing every offer of relief from her foreman. Nate heard of it from the mercantile owner, near dusk, and rode out without being asked, a jar of dried feverfew and willow bark tucked in his coat. The same mixture his late wife had once brewed to see Josie through her own bad winter. 3 years back, he found Margaret on the bunkhouse steps at twilight, hollow-eyed, her hands red and raw from washing linens. "You look like you haven't slept in 2 days." "I haven't." He held the jar out. "Won't cure it, but it'll bring the fever down some, ease the aching some. My wife used to make it." Margaret took the jar carefully, turning it in her hands. "Used to?" She passed. 4 years back. Giving me Josie." He hadn't meant to say quite that much. It slipped out plain, the way honest things sometimes do when a person's too weary to keep guarding them. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "Wasn't your doing. Doesn't mean I can't be sorry it happened anyhow." She went back inside to see to her hands. Nate stayed and split firewood behind the cookhouse without anybody asking him to, because there was work needing doing, and he'd never once in his life been the kind of man to ride off while there was work needing doing. By the 3rd night, every fever in that bunkhouse had broken. Margaret found him loading his wagon at dawn, ready to head back to town and open the forge. "You didn't have to come out here, Nathaniel." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He noticed that too. "No," he said. "I wanted to." She studied him a long moment, the same measuring look from that first day in the yard. Except this time he had the strong sense she wasn't hunting for what might be wrong with him. "Most men who've offered me help these past 2 years wanted something for it," she said. "Land. Standing. A wife foolish enough to sign her ranch over quiet-like, without asking too many questions first. I didn't come out here for any of that, Mrs. Voss." "I know," she said. "That's exactly what I'm getting at." I want to pause the story right here a moment, friend, and thank you, sincerely, for spending this evening with me. This story has traveled further than I ever expected it to, reaching listeners in small towns and big cities, across more countries than I could have guessed when I first sat down to write it. Now, let's get back to Nathaniel and Margaret. By late summer, Nate was out at the Voss ranch 3 days out of most weeks, mending gates, shoeing horses, patching whatever needed patching. and staying longer, most evenings, than the work strictly demanded. Josie came along nearly every time now. She and Margaret had taken to sitting together on the porch steps at dusk, the girl sounding out words from one of the horse books, while Margaret corrected her gently, patiently, never once making her feel small for stumbling. One evening, mending a stretch of corral fence gone gray with age, Nate found Margaret working the opposite post without being asked, sleeves rolled, hammer steady in her own capable hand. "You don't need to do that," he said. "That's my work you're doing. It's my fence. Fair point, I suppose." They worked a while in a silence that wasn't empty so much as full of things neither one of them was quite ready to say aloud yet. "My father built half this ranch with his own 2 hands," Margaret said finally, not looking up from her work. "People in town forget that. They see the house, they see the cattle count, and they assume it fell into my lap easy. It didn't. I've bled for every acre same as he did. And I mean to keep bleeding for it if that's what it takes. I never once doubted that of you. Most men do doubt it, that's the trouble of it. Every man who's come courting me these 2 years has looked at this ranch like a prize needing a firmer hand, not a thing I already know full well how to run myself." Nate drove the last nail home and straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "I never once thought you needed managing, Margaret." "No," she said quietly, "you haven't." That fence held 2 nights later, through a windstorm bad enough to flatten half the range. The very section Margaret had insisted needed reinforcing, over her foreman's objections that it would hold fine as it stood. It did not hold fine as it stood. Every other stretch of fencing on the property came down. Theirs held true. Margaret rode out at first light to see it for herself, and found Nate already there, checking the posts one by one. "You were right about the bracing," she said. "You were right about it needing fixing in the first place. I just held the nails steady." She looked at him a long moment in the pale morning light, and something passed unspoken between them, something neither one gave a name to. Not yet. One rainy afternoon in September, Nate sat waiting out a downpour in Margaret's kitchen, while she worked through her monthly accounts at the table, muttering numbers under her breath that weren't quite adding up right. "Something troubling you. Feed bills higher than it ought to be. 3rd month running. I can't find where the difference is coming from, and my last foreman never once bothered to check it close, just paid whatever the mill invoiced, and called it settled." Nate glanced over, uninvited but not unwelcome, at the column of figures she'd been chewing over for the better part of an hour. "May I?" She slid the ledger across without much hesitation, which he noted was itself a kind of trust she hadn't extended easily to anyone since he'd known her. It took him only a few minutes, running his finger down the entries, cross-checking against the delivery dates scrawled in the margin. "Here," he said. "Mill's been billing you for full wagon loads twice in the same week, same delivery date both times. Either it's an honest mistake in their bookkeeping, or somebody's skimming the difference before it ever reaches your ledger." Margaret leaned over the page, and her jaw tightened as the numbers settled into place before her eyes. "That's near $11 a month, going back 3 months. $33 gone, and nobody the wiser. Closer to 34 once you count the partial week in June." She sat back in her chair, studying him with an expression he was coming to know well. Not quite surprise anymore, but something warmer. Something that had stopped being surprised by his steadiness, and started simply expecting it. "Every man I've hired to keep these books for me has either been too lazy to check the figures proper, or too dishonest to want them checked at all," she said. "You're neither. I just look at what's actually written down, Margaret. Most folks see what they expect to see instead. That's a rarer gift than you seem to think it is." It was Josie who finally said it plain, the way children so often do, without knowing they've said much of anything at all. They were at supper, the 3 of them, gathered at Margaret's kitchen table, which by then had become such an ordinary sight that nobody remarked on it anymore. Josie looked up from her plate, chewing thoughtfully, and announced, "Papa, are you gonna marry Mrs. Voss?" 'Cause I already like her better than any of the other mamas I've seen around town. And I think you like her an awful lot too. On account of you smile different whenever she talks." The silence that followed had real weight to it. Margaret set her fork down very carefully. Nate felt his ears go hot clear to the tips. "Josiebird, that's not a supper table sort of question." "Why not?" "It's true. Ain't it? You do smile different." Margaret looked at Nate across the table, and for the first time since he'd known her, he watched something unguarded cross her face. Not embarrassment, but something closer to hope, quickly reined back in out of old habit. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said softly, and returned to her plate. Though her hands weren't entirely steady doing it, he asked her 3 days later, out by the fence they'd mended together, because it seemed the fitting place to ask. "I'm not a wealthy man, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name to her face. "I've got a forge, $60 saved, and a daughter who already loves you more than I've got words enough to explain. That's the whole of what I've got to offer you." "That's not nothing, Nathaniel. There's more you ought to know first, before you decide anything at all." He told her then, the life before the forge, that he'd trained as a mining engineer back east, had once staked and proved a claim himself, worked as an assayer, whose opinion men twice his age had sought out on ore samples worth real money. That he'd walked away from every bit of it the week his wife died, because whatever ambition had driven him stopped mattering the moment she was gone, and a quiet forge in a small town was a simpler life. A life he could raise Josie inside without losing what was left of himself to grief. "There's a claim," he said. 60 acres bordering your northern range up past the ridge. Filed under my legal name 7 years back, before I ever set foot in Larkspur Crossing. Never told a soul in town about it. Some days I nearly forget it myself." Margaret went very still. "The Ironwood claim. You know of it?" "I've spent 2 years trying to learn who holds title to that ground. It sits over the only spring that doesn't run dry come August, the one water source. My northern herd depends on when the creek fails. I'd assumed it belonged to some absent speculator down in Helena who'd never once bothered to work it. It belongs to me." She studied him, and he watched her turn the news over carefully. Not greed in her face. He could see that plain, but something more cautious. Whether the man standing in front of her was the same man who'd handed her a jar of fever tonic and asked for nothing in return. "I'm not asking you to marry me for water rights, Margaret," he said quietly. "I'm asking because Josie lights up like a lamp every time she catches sight of you, and because I haven't smiled the way I do around you since before my wife passed, and because I believe, I hope, you might feel something close to the same." "I do," Margaret said simply. "But you should know something too, before I answer you plain. I've been asked before, and every man doing the asking wanted this ranch a good deal more than he ever wanted me. I don't want your ranch, Margaret. I've got 60 acres of my own, should it ever come to that." She nearly laughed at that. "Yes, as it turns out, you certainly do." The complication rode in on a gray gelding 2 weeks later, dressed in a coat far too fine for cattle country, with a wife on his arm dressed finer still, and a lawyer trailing a respectful half-step behind them both, Roland Ashby. Margaret's husband once, 6 years back, before he'd left her for a woman whose family owned a silver operation outside Butte and offered him better prospects than a struggling cattle ranch ever could. "Margaret," he said, dismounting in her yard like he still held some claim to the ground beneath his boots. "You're looking well. This is Constance, my wife." Constance Ashby offered a thin, practiced smile and did not extend her hand. "What brings you out here, Roland?" "Business, mostly. Constance's family is looking to expand their mining interests into this territory, and there's a claim just north of your range, the old Ironwood filing. We'd like to buy it outright, and the water rights running through it besides." "Generous terms, Margaret. We might even discuss buying back into the ranch itself, if you were amenable to it. A fresh start, for old time's sake. I know things ended poorly between us, but I've done well for myself since, and I'd see you taken proper care of this time, the way you always deserved." "I was taken care of proper the first time around," Margaret said. I simply wasn't taken care of honest. Roland's smile thinned at the edges but held. Don't let pride cost you a fortune, Margaret. Constance's family has money enough to make this the finest cattle operation in the territory, water rights included. All you'd need do is say yes. Margaret looked at him a long, level moment. The man who'd once told her plainly she could never run a ranch alone, who'd ridden off the moment somebody wealthier came calling, who now stood in her own yard offering her the very security he'd once sworn she'd never manage without him. There's a small problem with your offer, Roland, she said, and there was no triumph in it, only plain fact. The ironwood claim isn't mine to sell. Don't be difficult, Margaret. Everybody in this territory knows that claim sat abandoned for years. It hasn't been abandoned in the slightest. She said it evenly. It belongs to a blacksmith here in Larkspur Crossing, man by the name of Nathaniel Hollis. You'll need to take your offer to him directly. Roland's expression flickered. Surprise first, then something colder, calculating. A blacksmith holds title to 60 acres of prime mining ground. He does, Margaret agreed. And I intend to marry him besides, so whatever offer you're planning to make, you'd best make it knowing that plainly. Constance's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. Roland looked between the two women, like a man hurriedly recalculating, a hand of cards he'd been certain he already understood. You'd choose a hired man's wages over what we're offering you. I'd choose a man who fixed my hay rake in 50 minutes flat, and never once told me he could run my own ranch better than I could, Margaret said. A man who sat up 2 nights running with my sick hands and asked for nothing in return. I built this ranch up with my own 2 hands once already, Roland. I don't need a fortune to feel secure in myself. I already know precisely what I'm capable of. What I lacked, until this past year, was somebody willing to see that plainly and never once feel threatened by it. Constance finally spoke, her voice cool and clipped. You'd really turn down $40,000 for a blacksmith's 40 acres of scrub and a hired man's calloused hands. 60 acres, Margaret corrected. And they're not scrub. They're the reason my herd doesn't die of thirst every August. But no, Mrs. Ashby, I wouldn't turn down $40,000 for Nathaniel's hands. I'd turn down every dollar you and your family could ever hope to offer, and count myself the wealthier woman for having done it. You always did have more pride than sense, Margaret, Roland said. Funny, Margaret said. I recall you saying the very same thing the week you left. Seems your opinion of me hasn't changed much since. Mine of you certainly has. You'll regret this decision, Roland said, swinging back up into the saddle, his fine coat suddenly looking a touch too tight across the shoulders. I regretted the last 6 years a good deal more, Margaret said. I won't be regretting this one. They rode off in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, and neither one came back to Larkspur Crossing again. Margaret told Nate that same evening, out by the fence they'd mended together, the whole of it. The offer, the money on the table, the choice she'd made before Roland had even finished laying out his case. You could have had a genuine fortune, Nate said. I've had money before in my life, Nathaniel. It never once kept me warm of a winter night, nor fixed a rake in under an hour, nor taught. She stopped herself, caught the words, tried again more carefully. Nor taught Josie to read without once making her feel small for stumbling over the hard words. She's not your daughter yet, Margaret. No, Margaret said, but I'd very much like her to be, if her father's still asking. He is, Nate said. He's asking you plainly right now. Then my answer's yes. They married that October, in the yard beside the fence they'd mended together, under a sky gone gold with the last light of autumn. It was a small gathering, the ranch hands, the mercantile owner, the doctor who'd finally made it back from that difficult birth weeks, too late for the fever, but stayed on gladly for the wedding instead. Josie carried the ring on a small cushion she'd sewn herself, stitches lopsided and proud, and refused to let a single other soul carry it the whole walk down. When the preacher asked if anyone present objected to the union, Josie piped up loudly from the front row, I sure don't. I've been waiting on this for months and months. It drew the only laugh of the entire ceremony, and Margaret laughed hardest of anyone there, bright tears standing in her eyes even as she did. 3 years on, the Hollis Voss Ranch. Folks in town had long since stopped bothering to separate the two names. It was simply the Hollis place to everyone now. Ran nearly double the cattle it once had under Margaret alone. And the Ironwood Spring fed clean water to both ranges through a system Nate had engineered himself. Drawing on knowledge he'd once believed he'd buried for good the week his first wife died. He kept the forge running too, 3 days out of the week, because a man ought to keep hold of the thing that built him, even after better things came along, to fill the rest of his life. Folks who once whispered about the quiet blacksmith with no land to his name, now spoke of Nathaniel Hollis, engineer and rancher both, in a different tone entirely. Though Nate himself never seemed to notice the change, or much care about it either way. Josie was 9 now, sharp as her stepmother and steady as her father both, and had taken to reading over Margaret's ranching ledgers on slow afternoons purely for the pleasure of it, correcting the sums whenever she found an error, which she usually did. One evening, Nate found Margaret out on the porch steps, watching Josie chase fireflies across the yard with a new addition to the family. Their son, not yet 2 years old, asleep and heavy against her shoulder, while the sun went down gold over land that belonged now to every one of them equally. "Rake still holding up out there?" he asked, settling in beside her. "Best 50 minutes work anybody's ever done for me in my whole life," Margaret said, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the two of them sat there together, as the light faded soft over the valley, needing nothing more in that moment than exactly what they already had. "I've told a good many stories now about pride and second chances, but this one taught me something simple. I don't believe I'll ever forget. The people worth building a life alongside rarely announce themselves with fortune or flattery. More often than not, they simply show up, fix what's broken without being asked twice, and stay through every storm that follows. If you've been waiting on some grand gesture to prove somebody's worth trusting, perhaps look instead to who's already quietly showing up for you, day after ordinary day. Thank you, truly and sincerely, for spending this time with me tonight. It means a great deal more than you likely know. Until next time, keep listening.